Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. This is a meeting of the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee, or EETAC, as we like to call it. We are meeting by Zoom these days, so just as a reminder, you can keep your camera on and keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. And then if you would like to speak, you can use the raise hand feature, which is probably the easiest, but I can also usually see this. So first on the agenda is approval of the October 7th Zoom meeting summary. And I did have a chance to review that. I know I had to cut out a little early, so I would entertain a motion if someone would like to make such thing.
This is Howard. I'll move approval.
Okay.
I'll second.
All right, moved by Howard, second by Alexis. Any discussion on the meeting summary or video or anything like that? All right, I'll go ahead and call for the vote. All of those in favor, you may raise your virtual hand. I think we can see everybody. Okay, and any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, looks like we have a unanimous. Elena, I'm hoping you captured all that, but of course that's why we record, right? Okay, we do also reserve the beginning of each of our meetings for public comment. So at this time, I am going to see if there is anybody who wishes to address the committee this evening. If so, I was going to say, I do see an attendee. I guess we would ask you to raise your hand if that's a possibility, and if not, then does not appear as though. Oh,
there we go.
Oh, wait, do I see a hand? I can't tell. I'm sorry, Elena. I'll let you.
We have a hand. I think Betsy Schultz is here watching tonight, so
Okay.
I'm gonna allow her to talk for a minute.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry, I wasn't sure if Tiffany, you were telling me I was supposed to raise my hand or it was an option to raise my hand. So yes, Betsy Schultz, I represent the Realtor Associations in Lane County and appreciate all the hard work that you guys have been doing. And I'm just dropping in to listen this evening. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Betsy. We appreciate having a public commenter. So thank you so much. Okay. Well, with that, I don't think we have any other comments for this evening. So I will turn it over to Heather to go over our second agenda item, which is our growth monitoring building permits. And we're going to continue that discussion from our past meetings. So Heather, take it away.
Thank you. And as some of you heard earlier, I've been having some spotty internet issues. So if anything, just jump in if I cut off or whatever, because I'm sure that will happen because it keeps happening. Okay, so you can see the presentation, thumbs up.
Looks good.
So we are picking up where we left off the last meeting. Thank you for all of you and your patience and allowing me to kind of bomb through the housing density slides from last time. So we're going to pick that up, and I think last time we mentioned that we were doing some additional density analysis around land use applications. So Elena is going to touch on that. We'll do an overview of employment permits, and we have a couple areas that we can talk about: BLI impact, and then the number of permits that we're seeing. We're still analyzing our efficiency measures, so we'll talk about the next steps at the end of the meeting as far as when we're going to talk about it, those. So just as a reminder, this information is net density information because it's coming from building permits. And so when we talk about net density versus gross density, net density is the housing units per acre of land that is not in roads. And when we talk about BLI net density, it's housing acres per buildable area of land. So excluding parks, or sorry, not parks, protected areas and committed areas like easements. And so by the time we get to building permit, we're already looking at net density because we're just looking at the tax lot. So if it was a subdivision, when we're looking at land use application, like we're reviewing a plat, then we're looking at gross density because we have the parent tax lot before any land is dedicated to right of way. But by the time we get to building permit, we're looking at just the individual tax lot that now has the streets dedicated around it. And so every time you take, your net density is always going to be higher than your gross density because you started here, then you took away land for roads, and then you get to the buildable tax lot. And then if you take away land for a protected and committed area, then you get an even higher density because you're taking away acreage. So one of the things I wanted to mention that I didn't really talk about last time, as we start to compare most of the forecasted densities that you're seeing were based on historic trends and assuming that those would continue, with the exception of medium density residential, where the forecasted average reflects the fact that we actually increased the minimum density in the R2 zone so that we would see a higher density on average in MDR. Medium density residential, but otherwise, these are basically from looking at 12 years of development while we were doing the UGB analysis. And as we're comparing the densities that we're seeing, and we're seeing some of these big increases or decreases from what we forecasted, there's a couple of things I want to point out, or I guess one big thing is that this is data that we didn't really have when we did the UGB analysis. So we did not have net density from building permits at the time the building permit was submitted, which is what we're getting now. We're getting real live building permit comes in, here's the tax lot acres, here's how much is protected, how many units over the development site, over those tax lot acres. We're getting that like right now as we're reviewing the building permit. When we were doing the UGB analysis, we didn't have that luxury. And so we had to do some GIS analysis with address points. So our GIS system has an address point layer in it, and we can count up all the addresses, and they have what type of building they are. But you can imagine, and then you're using the tax lot layer, and then you're using the protected layer. So there's a lot of things going on. And then we were only trying to look at development that happened from 2001 to 2012. So that was one whole GIS analysis that was an estimate, but this is better, right? This is better data because it's happening in real time. We're looking at the time of the building permit. The other information is that similarly, when we get to land use applications, we also didn't have that kind of real-time density data for land use applications. Again, we kind of went back, did a backfill look at, okay, let's look at plats during this time frame and do a GIS analysis. Good work, but it's part of the reason that we wanted to set up a growth monitoring program. This is a really good example of where we said, hey, this is the data we have right now. We're going to go forward with it, but we want to get better data. And so we're getting that now. So I'm not saying that the 5.4 or the 32.6 density that we saw in 2001 to 2012 and that we assumed would go forward is wrong. I'm just saying it was collected a little bit differently. And so while I do think that dwellings are coming in more dense than we forecasted generally, exactly how much, like 31.5%, is probably not exactly right, because again, the methods for collection are just a little bit different. And so I just want to make sure that that's out there. You know, we're doing what we said we would do, which would be which is to get better data, but it also means that we don't exactly have an apples to apples comparison. And then, you know, as a reminder, we didn't even have this data density by dwelling unit type. And that's not something that helps us right now, but it will help us going forward when we do our next housing needs analysis. Same with the average density over the different land types. So this is where it gets really detailed. So just as a reminder, we've got what we just talked about was net density on average over the whole plan designation. But in actuality, when we applied a density to get a capacity estimate to our land, we actually broke it out not just by plan designation, but by the elevation above or below 900 feet, the slope above or below 5% slope, and then these three size classifications. So what's cool is that the building permits, because they are linking to a copy of our buildable lands inventory, we are actually able to see real time when a building permit comes in, which one of these bins does it fall in? Does it fall into this lot at the time of the BLI, which could be different because it could have been a large lot then, and now it's a tiny lot being developed on. At the time of the BLI, was it, you know, under 900 feet and it was flat and it was, you know, 5 acres or greater. So it hadn't been subdivided yet. And now the building permits coming in. And if we reran the BLI now, it would be less than an acre, but it's falling, you know, the density is falling into this 5 or more because that's where the development was, or that's the size of the lot that it was at the time of the BLI. So that's how we get a little bit of that more apples to apples comparison. So I talked about this a little bit last time. I know this is kind of ugly, so I added another slide to really highlight what we want to focus on. So here we have the 2001 to 2012 average net density. This wasn't broken out quite as much as the above or below 900, so that's why you're seeing a lot of repeating. This is not a mistake. Then we're seeing what the densities that we're getting right now. This is the forecasted density, and this is the percent difference from the between the density we're seeing now and the forecasted density. And then we also have the number of units that this density is based on. And so what I'm trying to point out here, and the next slide will do it a little bit better, is that there's some areas where like this is 90% less dense than the forecast. Well, there was only 1 unit. So there really isn't, you know, there really isn't enough data here to really talk about that. Same with these groups right here. 48 is better, 4 is not very good. And so this is what a cleaned up version looks like, and this is what it'll look like in the report. So we've got in green the densities that are higher than the forecast, and we've just replaced with not enough data the percentages. So that's not the focus, and the densities, so those aren't the focus, and but left the dwellings, so you can see why I'm saying that there's not enough. The sample size is too small. So again, that's part of the reason I want to just be sure we pointed this out, is that, you know, even some of these here, 33 units is not a whole bunch, right? And so some of these, even where it's like, you know, I don't know individually, you know, it's still a pretty small sample size. The other thing, I think I mentioned this last time, that you will see as we go through these charts is that the majority of development has happened on flat land. So even a little bit of flat sloped, not here, but you'll see as we go through. The majority of development has been on flat, like overwhelmingly has been on flat land. So medium density residential, same thing. You know, there was no development on sloped larger lot, medium or large lots. So there's just not enough data there. These are lower than the forecast, but again, I think the original, oh yeah, here it is, 13.4. So actually this is actually a little bit higher than, or probably about the same really, from historical data. And this one's a little bit lower. But again, this is what's assumed given the R2 increase in density, which also, by the way, didn't go into effect until 2017. And so if we're using building permits from the end of 2012 all the way through mid 2021, that code amendment that required the minimum density to be increased in R2 didn't go into effect, didn't go into the code until 2017. And we're still seeing development, like building permit development that this data is coming from, is still from approvals that happened before that code amendment went into effect. So it's going to be a while until we reach this average density probably.
Heather, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Can you go back where you just were? Okay, so maybe this is a silly question and we've answered it in something else, but does this factor in the supply? Because when I'm looking at, you know, you're saying the greater than over 900, greater than 5% slope, does it factor in what we know to be available? Because I mean, we're seeing that nothing has been built at that. And, you know, I mean, other than a less than an acre. So I don't know, I guess I just would be curious to know, like, what do we know about that inventory at all? Does that make sense? And maybe that's a silly question.
So, yeah, I'm not sure I'm following. So this is what the lot, at the time of the BLI, these are the land, like characteristics of the lot at the time the BLI was run, which could be different than if you ran the BLI now for the lot that's coming in at the building permit. So is that what you mean? Like we haven't rerun, I mean, we've rerun the BLI and Thea, you know, we've talked about that with Thea, and we're going to have some numbers that tell us how many acres are in all of these areas now. But this is just about what was the classification of the lot, that portion of the lot that the building permit is now coming on. What was the classification back at the time of the BLI?
Okay.
Is that, I don't feel like I'm answering your question.
No, I think I'm actually the one confused, so it's okay. I'm gonna keep following along. Ed has his hand up. Oh, and then Phil has his hand up. So Ed, go ahead, and then Phil, you'll go. You can go after Ed.
Okay.
Hang on, Ed. Something just happened with your sound. We just lost you. I don't know if he can hear us. We can't hear you. Can you hear us? Oh, now I can hear you.
Okay, let me try again. A couple of slides back where you had the average net density in land over 900 feet, it looked like the majority of the South Hills ended up being a net density of 3.2. And I seem to recall when we went through this before, that was 2.5. Can you tell me what happened there?
That was gross.
Okay.
2.5 was
Okay.
gross. Yep. And so when we get down to, actually, we put those charts that were the gross density. Those were in the latest PDF that Elena sent out. It's at the very bottom of the PDF. It has those original adopted assumptions. So you can see how it went from net, and then we applied a percentage. We reduced, and we're going to talk about this, but we reduced the net density down to get a gross, and you'll see that 2.5 in that last table. So we just haven't gotten there yet.
Okay.
Okay. Phil, you're up.
I'm not sure if this is going to cover maybe what Tiffany was getting at or not, but on this slide here, it just kind of occurred to me, or I was wondering, obviously, development's been occurring on the flatter slopes. I mean, it's easier to develop. Where they have these 48 dwellings that are above 5% in slope and above 900 feet, and then 32 units on 5+ acres. Are those like single projects, or are they a variety of different, 48 dwellings on 48 different parcels that just so happen to be above 5%? And does it, the degree to which it even matters, but it might tell you something about, hey, it's just somebody got lucky with a flatter piece of slope and easier to develop in one manner or another. I don't know.
Got it. Yeah, sorry if that's what you meant, Tiffany. We can look into that. I know that I looked at that when we first, and I don't remember. We've looked at a lot of data, but we can definitely follow up and get back to you guys about that.
Yeah, it's just such small numbers, smallish numbers in the scheme of things. It's kind of might tell you something like, hey, somebody was just able to kind of crack the code and be able to develop at these higher than average or higher than forecasted densities, and whether it was just dumb luck or good planning on their part or what, so I don't know what that tells you, but
Yep, great. Yeah.
Okay. No more. I don't have any more hands. So.
Okay. No, that's great. So I'm just going to skip right now that you're familiar with what I've done with these charts. I'm just going to move past the old HDR and commercial chart to the new one. So again, not enough data on these over 5% slope. We did have 9 units that were on the small lots, but mostly flat land. We don't have a lot of HDR. I don't have the acres of how much HDR was slope above 5% slope anyway, but I don't think it was very much. MDR, there was a little bit more in our supply that was above 5% slope, but HDR is pretty small. So it makes sense, like this is one where it makes sense that most of the housing is coming in on the flat land, given what is in the supply, what the supply is made of. It's a little bit surprising that the density is less than the average. And there's a lot of units there. I'm not sure why that is. We could look into that. It could just be this again, as a reminder, the average is from this 12 years worth of data, and we're only looking at about 8. So, things do average out over time. And then with commercial, we really didn't have a forecast for commercial. We just said, we are going to fit 1,000 more units downtown on commercial land through MUFD and other incentives downtown. We didn't say what density was going to be, anything like that. However, I do remember that when we were looking at the 2001 to 2012 building permits, I remember that any housing, which there wasn't a ton that was on commercial land during that time, was closer to the HDR densities of 32.6, and we're certainly seeing some pretty high densities. And I think on average, if I remember correctly, commercial was around 80, 88 on average, well, 78.6. So higher even on average than HDR. But that's why this doesn't have any forecast information. But, you know, we're setting this up so that we can redo these charts the next time we adopt the new UGB. We might have a forecasted density for commercial. Looks like we have a hand.
Yeah, Phil's got his hand up.
Last time we talked about student housing. I'm curious about how, I would imagine probably in the commercial category, maybe in somewhere in HDR too, but if you took that out, took those projects out, how, you know, how would it materially change these, or would it? I would assume it would, but. And also, where would you fit within this? I assume commercial, but special area zones?
Yeah, so this is by plan designation. So if it's a special area zone, it could be on, I mean, generally the special area zones say what zone they're implementing, and generally that should be what a matching plan designation.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Well,
a
that's
great
again-
question.
well,
I'm not
again, I was just going to say, just as we talked about last time, if you're able to, you know, figure out some nifty way to map this stuff, that it's going to probably pop out, and you're
we
gonna,
have a draft.
all right.
Yes, we have a draft. It's coming. It'll be in the report. Thea just, I haven't even looked at it. I just saw that she has done that. So we will have a draft, and we're even setting it up so that we'll be able to do it in Tableau. So that whenever it is that we get to do a dashboard online, that people can see. Hopefully this will set us up to have an interactive map so you can kind of zoom in. Yeah. So it would, yes, I will make a note about the student housing on the density. I can't say that we will have that in time for the report when you guys look at it, but I do think that there is going to be some additional information, because we need to get this report to you guys to look at. We need to get it in your hands. And so I do feel like there's going to be some things like that we might just put a note in the report that says, we're working on this, we'll fill this in, and then we can let you guys know. And then hopefully we can put that data in for the Planning Commission and City Council. But I will make a note of that. We did put in numbers. We do have the numbers for potentially student housing, and how much of that is 5 or more units, which almost all of it is. So we do have that information in the report. So sorry about this slide. So this is what we were talking about earlier. Ed, thank you for throwing me a softball about where that 2.5 came from. So what we have to do, like I was talking a little bit about earlier, is that we have net density assumptions from the buildable lot at the time of the building permit. If we just applied that to our buildable lands inventory, so say we have 100 acres in low density residential, and we applied that net density to those 100 acres of buildable land, which means there's no protected area or anything. That net density would be saying, well, we're going to get 5.4 units over that land. That's what we're going to get. But it's not taking into account the fact that when you actually look at land divisions, and even if you don't look at land, when you look across the city, roads and streets are needed to serve that development. And so you might have 100 acres of buildable land, but not all of that land is going to be developed with housing. So it's not accurate to say that 5.4 units per acre is the capacity of that land. You actually have to reduce all of these net densities. And these are the ones that we adopted in Envision Eugene, which now we'll be replacing with the monitoring data for coming up with an estimate in the BLI. We're not adopting these, but just for coming up with an estimate in the new BLI. So we'll put in those net densities that I was just showing. And then Elena is going to talk about the information from our land division applications that shows how much, what percentage of land has been dedicated to streets to serve those types of development. We have a lot more information for low density residential because we see a lot of subdivisions, land divisions and low density residential. We don't see as many, we don't see as many land divisions in medium and high density residential. So our sample size is a lot smaller. So I just want to preface the information that Elena is going to be sharing with saying that this is, we're going to run the math a couple different ways and to get an estimate. This estimate is not being adopted. We already know we have to reassess our UGB. So in a way, kind of regardless of what capacity we end up having on our rerun BLI, we already know that we're going to go back into a UGB analysis because the state has told us we have to by 2026. And so I want to give you that as some comfort because I think we will revisit this when we do our housing needs assessment. So we take what we did in the Envision Eugene is we took the 5.4 and then we reduced it by 4%, 14%, or 26%, depending on the lot size of that land in the buildable land supply. Same with medium density residential. And so this is all from this interconnected spreadsheet we call the land sufficiency model, where you plug these in. That's why they're in green, because they're assumptions that you plug into the land model. And if they're in gray, then that's a locked in number. It came from a calculation. So we reduced 5.4 by 4% in all of these categories. And so that's how we got 5.2, 4.6, and 4.0. The 2.5 that Ed was bringing up is a little bit different. We didn't actually have to reduce the 2.5 by any percentage because that 2.5 was derived from an analysis of plats already. So it already accounted for land that would be used for streets. So we didn't have to reduce that. That was something we found out later in the process. We didn't realize that originally. And so we would have set this whole land model up differently and to make everything kind of flow more clearly and more transparently. And that's what we'll be working on to show you. I want to expand this so it looks more like this. And then I want to kind of expand this so it looks more like this. So it really is fleshed out. So you can just go step one, we can see all of the steps much more clearly. This is just a result. It doesn't look like that because it was an evolution through the UGB analysis process. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this slide after Elena shares her information.
Okay, so switching over to land use applications, not permits. We calculated the net to gross factor and the average gross density in two different ways. So the two options are shown here. So both are derived from the final approved partitions and subdivisions from 2012 through September 29th of this year, 2021. And so in one of them, it is only final subdivisions and partitions. And then in the other, we included final plan unit developments, but we removed any duplicate final subdivisions that had already been part of a PUD. So you can see the number of land use applications is in brackets in the charts. And so there's not a huge difference in both of them. So you can see there was 129 low density residential less than half an acre. But when you have some of, the number sample size is pretty small when you get to, medium density residential, 1 to 5 acre, it jumps from one land use application to 2 land use applications. But we sort of wanted some of your feedback on which option to go with. We are sort of recommending and leaning towards option 2 because it gives a more complete picture of how much right of way is actually needed for the entire site, rather than for each phase of a multi-phased land division. And same with gross density, it provides sort of more of a complete picture with what's needed for roads versus open space and protected areas versus housing. So the gross density from these land use applications is being used as a double check on the gross density when we calculated it from the net density from building permits reduced by the percentage of streets. So it's sort of calculating gross density in 2 different ways and using them as a check on each other. So yeah, I think that's all I have to share on that side.
Are you looking at this point, Elena and Heather, for input as to which the group prefers, or anybody want to chime in? And
Yeah, I think if you have any questions about our recommendation, which is to use option 2, and yeah, if you have, or any concerns, it'd be good to know.
yeah, I guess I'll pose that of the group. If there are any concerns in particular with option 2, I guess I would say speak up. Otherwise, I would personally feel very comfortable with your recommendations, but sometimes it can get wonky. Wait, Phil had his hand up, but then he took it down.
Sorry, I was trying to do a virtual kind of thumbs up. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So a virtual thumbs up. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing anybody that appears to have any heartburn over option 2. So
Sue's got her hand up now.
oh, Sue, I see your hand. Go ahead.
So how many applications are there at any given time for planned unit developments?
I don't know. Heather, do
Yeah,
you know?
I don't have that information at the top of my fingertips. I know that or I don't know, but I recall that when we looked at the 2001 to 2012 PUDs, where we got the 2.5 units per acre, it was like, and those were just in the South Hills, but that's primarily where we see the PUDs. I want to say it was like around 12 for that whole period, maybe 12 to 16, something like that.
Yeah, okay. Well, that gives me some perspective because it's hard to evaluate these numbers without knowing how many are there, I mean, in the scope of things. So that's helpful.
And, the problem I saw with including, like, just looking only at the plats, which would be the more true information, because when there's a final subdivision plat or a final partition plat, then the right of way is platted, so it has actually happened. But when you have a really large PUD and it's coming in phases, part of that PUD may not be in your monitoring period. It could have already happened. or it may not happen for the period that you're looking at, it might happen later. And so you're just getting the information from that one portion that's being platted right now, which could have the most right of way dedicated of all phases of the PUD, or it could have, you know, the least amount, you know, and so so I guess what we were thinking is that if we exclude the partitions and subdivisions that are part of PUDs that are in that monitoring period, then at least for those, you're getting the true picture of how much right of way was needed for the whole thing, and not like an off, you know, something that might throw your average off just because it was one part of the subdivision versus another part.
And I just looked, there were 17 PUDs between 2012 and September of this year.
Kevin, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just think it's important to recognize the difference between real-time monitoring, where you want sort of exact data as phases come in or something like that, versus kind of hind casting and looking back and seeing trends to create averages. Because the real-time stuff is going to give you noise. I mean, they're going to be, you know, things that are outside the average graph, just because the world is full of noise. You know, things, you have a big project and you may have a year with no project. So as I see it, that's kind of what we're saying here, is what you're doing here is trying to generate some numbers for forecasting purposes. And so you want the most complete stuff, but it's not representative of an exact thing happening in a given year. Whereas, yeah. So, and, you know, small sample sizes are dangerous. And I really thank you guys for continuing to remind us of that.
See a lot of heads shaking, so nodding. I feel like people are agreeing with you, Kevin. Okay,
If I
I
can
don't have,
add
yeah.
one more thing. The other thing we can do is we can run the density analysis with the old net to gross instead of the new, particularly for MDR and HDR, just because it's so small. But you know, I guess what I'm thinking is that because we know we're going to look at this again when we do the housing needs analysis, and we'll actually have to adopt something that will buy us some time to look into this a little bit further and see if we can get some more data that potentially goes further back, or you know, if there's something else that can help us. And we'll also be able to compare these gross density assumptions we're seeing here and the ones we saw in 2001 to 2012, and do some more comparisons when we actually are getting ready to adopt a capacity analysis.
Okay. I don't have any more hands, so I think you're good to keep going.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll do that analysis. That is our next steps is to replace these tables with the monitoring data, and we'll at least start there, and then come up with some numbers, and we'll do some testing, look at or comparisons, I should say, to what we were seeing in land use applications for gross density. And we'll do a write-up and get back to you about that. So we'll definitely follow up.
Okay.
Yeah, and then this is the last piece that we need to be able to get a capacity estimate out of the buildable lands inventory that you all helped review. So this is the last piece that Thea is waiting for. And then we'll include that information. She's got a nice write-up on a summary of the buildable lands inventory, how many acres in all of the land categories are annexed versus not annexed, and some of the things that we've been bringing up in this discussion. So that will help with that analysis. Any other questions? Because that's what we have for density, and then we would move on to employment.
Any questions on this part, or should we move on? Mark, go ahead.
Yes, in my understanding of what you're doing, excuse me just a moment here to get my screen to behave better. Yes, in my understanding of it, the function of this analysis will be to aid in projection for future planning purposes. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and that's really at the heart of the justification or the motivation for doing this, is to have a basis for planning. And inevitably, at that point, when we're thinking about planning, to me, it brings up a comparison to other urban areas and urban and suburban and whatnot, developed areas like Portland or Salem or whatever, Salt Lake City or Barcelona. And so I'm wondering, first of all, if you can make any kind of blanket statement or generalizations about the densities you're getting in this situation compared to what the densities you're getting by the particular measurements you're using, like acreage and number of dwelling units and so on, and road areas and whatnot, and how those compare to other places that are of interest to compare to, Portland for sure, but maybe even others. First of all, so that we or any viewer can understand whether we're speaking the same language here and now in Eugene that others speak whatever in Portland, or planners speak, I mean, in Portland, to understand development there. And then if we can establish that we are speaking the same language, and by that I mean that the numbers mean the same things in Eugene as they mean in Portland, say. If that is true, then it'd be interesting to know, well, if it's true or if it's not true, that in itself would be interesting. But beyond that, if we can understand that relationship and get some confidence that they're comparable, then we can compare to Portland or Barcelona or wherever. Because to me, the bigger picture of planning and urban planning has to do with a vision of what we want our city to be and how we want it to look, or how it could look, or how we can address problems by choosing this target density versus that target density for medium, high, and low density. And so what it comes down to, what I'm really asking about is, I guess, fundamentally, number one, how does this approach compare to the rest of the world, planning world, number one, and number two, how do the results compare to the rest of the planned world? And out of that, what can we learn about the approach that Eugene should take or could take that would make a difference to us? End of question.
Yeah, so if I can respond. Yeah, so that's one of those areas where with growth monitoring, we have some pretty specific things that we're trying to monitor, which are the assumptions that we made in the UGB analysis. What were they and what's happening now? Yeah, I think those are great things to think about when we're actually having vision and policy conversations, which we're not doing as part of growth monitoring. We may end up, and we should end up, reviewing the capacity results of policy changes. But that right now we're really just monitoring our trends compared to what we assumed. And then I think that next step, when we get to the UGB analysis, which is going to be hot on the heels of the growth monitoring report, will be when we are looking at things like, okay, well, the monitoring information did its job. It told us that, you know, here's how we were developing, here's how we're developing now. If we aspire to develop differently, what does that look like? How are they developing? And what does that look like? And what are the policy changes needed to make that happen? But we're not at that point yet. As far as the question of our density, is this density discussion the same as density numbers in a different city? Not exactly, because we're doing these for the purposes of figuring out capacity on our buildable lands inventory. People calculate, there's like net density, there's net density. I mean, this was pretty complicated, right? We talked about like 4 different types of density. And so I think what you would want to do, because we have done this before, where we just said, how many acres is Eugene? How many acres are in the city limits? And how many dwelling units do you have? And what is the density of the city of Eugene? That is much easier to do, to compare to other jurisdictions. With a GIS analysis, you could look at certain districts, but if you want to look at a whole city, and like you said, Barcelona or whatever, and some of that you would have to do through, because we don't have access to their GIS information as far as the number of dwelling units they have. So some of that you're relying on the information you can find on the internet. But I know that we have done comparisons before with other cities. And so you just have to know that sometimes it's not exactly an apple, it may not be an exact apples to apples comparison.
Okay, good. So, I mean, it's reassuring to hear your response, and especially if at some point there will be an effort. I'm inferring from what you said that at some point there would be at least some comparisons of the kind I was outlining that would enable us in Eugene to see where we stand relative to other ideal or non-ideal settings that we would, refer to.
Yeah, I think that, I'm not going to say that we're going to compare ourselves to Barcelona for sure. But I think that, I know one of the things that we looked at, we did compare Eugene to Paris, because, it was a European city that there's a lot of conversation about the density there because they have height limitations and what kind of density they get even with the height limitation. So I do remember that. I also remember comparing the mix of housing types that we get in Eugene compared to similar city sizes, Corvallis, Portland, other cities in Oregon. I think we even looked at Boulder, Colorado, some of those kind of sister cities. So we definitely did do some of that analysis. Some of it's easier to get than others, and some of it's more relevant than others because other places don't have the same land use system structure that we do in Oregon specifically. And so that's something we have to be really cognizant of.
Thank you.
Dennis, I'm going to call on you, but Heather, just as a follow-up to what you just said, is the reason, I know Paris has the same basic land use mass as Eugene, but are you looking at other cities with similar land use, or land mass? Or because you mentioned a couple of others. Yeah, well, when you're talking about density, I understand comparing Eugene to Paris, and I've done it many times because the population is so much higher and obviously they're so much denser, but they have the same area of land mass. So I'm just curious, when you say that, why Boulder or some of the other, what you called sister cities, are they comparable in size or?
Yeah, kind of medium-sized cities. They're some of them are college towns. Yeah. West Coast, just some things like that. Yeah, size. Okay. Not necessarily demographics per se, but the college part is particularly helpful because then you have some similarities as far as economies and that sort of thing.
Okay. Dennis, I apologize. I jumped in ahead of you, but go ahead.
No problem. It's sort of a speculation that's spinning for me, and I'm preface, I am the Sustainability Commission person here. In terms of is there any effort to get a handle on beyond development permit per site as how much of the land on that site is actually being developed? Square footage, totals for permits, including hardscape, clearly has environmental impacts in terms of stormwater system projections, in terms of looking at urban canopy possibilities. Is there any effort to collect total square footage of bare land being covered to give us an ability to look at those pieces that I asked about, stormwater impacts and potential for urban canopy in particular?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you were able to listen to the video from the last meeting.
I did listen last time, yeah.
Okay, so I think it was the last meeting that we talked about the buildable lands inventory impacts. Because I think before that was housing mix. So that was acres developed from housing permits. And then this next group of charts we're going to talk about is acres developed from employment permits. And so,
right.
Yeah.
Right, but my question is, a permit is a permit is a permit, whether it's a permit for 6,000 square feet or 1,000 square feet on that particular piece of property.
So what I thought I heard you ask was whether we were quantifying the acres developed due to a building permit, whether it's a building or for a parking area, like for the whole development, right?
Right.
And that is what the buildable impact acres that we talked about at the last meeting and that we're going to talk about here. That's what that is reviewing building permits for how many acres are being developed, not just from the building, but from the parking area, the landscaping, everything that's required to make that development function essentially.
So there is potentially an ability to tease out how much of it is really open space.
Oh,
space
you want it divided up
That's
so
what
that it's
I'm
like,
trying, that's the question I've got. Is there a way to tease out how much permeable space is available?
oh yeah, I didn't hear you say permeable space.
I mean, that's the first one that came up about stormwater, but also, I'm on an urban canopy subcommittee, and we're looking at, the impacts of timber. And I know we've got some ability to map density city-wise now under new iTree software that Public Works has, but is that looked at in terms of how much land are we clearing? How much land are we totally paving and how much is remaining as permeable or growable land?
So,
Can be,
oh,
we
go
don't
ahead,
know how to
Tiffany,
get
sorry.
there.
Well, I was just going to make an observation that when you look at Eugene from an aerial view, it's all canopy. I mean, because the trees are, overarched. And so, while the I don't know, I'm not sure if this is what you're getting at, but, the trees occupy space on the ground, but they occupy a lot more space above the houses and whatnot.
Right.
So I think that's why it'd be really hard to measure that, because especially, trees as they grow, they're going to take up more and more space, but they actually provide more canopy, but it doesn't compete with the houses because they grow above them. So
Well,
I wouldn't think that, if that makes sense.
I'm going to say, though, there is some data that parts of Eugene are not very green. And I think in particular of Train Song and some of the Bethel neighborhoods where there is very little urban canopy as compared to, I live on the slopes of, Hendricks Park. And it's like, you're right. If you take a Google map look of my neighborhood, it's all green. But there are areas where there are very different densities of urban canopy. But I'm also interested, having looked at in my own, one house development, the impact of the issues of planning for stormwater runoff was directly related in this individual plot to the amount of hard surface we're creating? Are we looking at that more, across properties? Or is that something that's just too fine a detail to be tabulated in a gross impact kind of questions? Those are the impacts I have, because a 6,000 square foot house on a piece of vacant land has a much more profound negative environmental impact than 1,000 square foot footprint. And that's my question. Is there a way to look at those impacts? And the answer may be, we don't have that at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we really don't have the capacity to do that at an individual building permit level. I think that there's some GIS analysis that could be done about where parking impervious and parking areas are using LiDAR data, but what's in stormwater versus what's landscaping versus even some parking areas is kind of hard to tell from LiDAR. So I guess the short answer is we're not doing that as part of growth monitoring. If there ended up being a policy that changed a development standard that we thought was going to impact our buildable lands inventory related to those things, then we would need to look at a more fine-grained level and do the analysis around that, but we're not collecting that data.
Right. Okay, that's what I was trying to get to, because at Sustainability Commission level, we're having some discussions around issues of urban canopy, particularly neighborhood to neighborhood. But I hear your answer. That might be able to be tabulated in the future if there's a look at some policy changes. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments or questions? I don't see any hands up, so.
I don't know if you guys saw my warning that my internet is unstable.
Oh, does it flash up at you? We can't see that, but.
Oh, okay, good. Well, my internet is unstable, just FYI. So so now we're going to transition into employment building permits. So this is the same slide that we gave last time when we were talking about housing permits, except for we're focused on employment. So generally employment permits, we are putting them into these three categories. Commercial, and basically commercial is kind of split up into commercial, non-retail, and commercial retail. So commercial, everything else, and then commercial retail. Industrial, which can be light industrial, more like campus industrial, like what's out on Chad Drive, or it could be heavy industrial. It's all lumped into one right now as we start talking about these permits. And then public and semi-public is, it looks like I have a comma there that didn't get finished. So public schools, public recreation, parks, facilities, miscellaneous government, if there was a new post office, things like that. But it also includes what we call semi-public uses. So private schools, what would be another one? Like a lodge of some, like an Eagles Lodge or Masonic Lodge, those kinds of things. Those would all fall under the public and semi-public realm or grouping. So monitoring employment development is a little bit different from housing. It's not as black and white, which I find a little dissatisfying. I will just be upfront about that. But basically, one way that it's similar is that when we look at our buildable lands inventory and we try to estimate how much capacity there is on vacant and partially vacant land for new housing and new employment, we, in both cases, do a density analysis. For housing, we were just talking about the density analysis, right? We apply a gross density assumption, a number of homes per acre, to estimate the capacity. With employment land, commercial, industrial, we also do a per acre number per acre, but it's actually jobs per acre, which doesn't really come from our building permits. So while we do the same kind of method, we actually don't get the data from the same place. We get the jobs data from an analysis of jobs data from Oregon Employment Department, and then we have to allocate that across the city to figure out what an EPA, employees per acre, is for different types of areas. So similar, but from different sources. Building permit data, we are capturing employment building square footage. So the net new employment building square footage that is being added by each of those categories. This is new data. We didn't have that data in the UGB analysis, but this was something we thought would be helpful going forward when we do our next economic opportunities analysis, which is the companion to our housing needs analysis. So the next time we do our new UGB, this information will be helpful, but it wasn't actually factored into to our UGB analysis, whereas dwellings that we got from building permits was. For determining the buildable lands inventory impact from building permits, when we looked at dwellings, we said, you know, what is the area that is being developed, that is the buildings with the dwellings, like we were just talking about, stormwater areas, utility areas, parking areas, open space required for apartments, almost everything related to new dwellings, with the exception of, well, and including accessory buildings for both multifamily and single family, provided that they come in with the new dwelling. So it's like all one development. If somebody builds a garage after the fact for their single family dwelling or their duplex, we're not capturing that. It's really our buildable lands inventory impact related to housing is related to what is the impact related to the new housing. With employment, it's a little bit different. Same stuff again, new buildings, additions. That additions we're not doing in housing unless they are additions that include new dwellings. So for employment, new buildings, additions, parking areas, landscaping, utility, all of those things, as well as standalone permits that are for parking areas or like a ball field or something like that. So there could be a buildable lands inventory impact that doesn't actually add building square feet. And then similar to housing, again, if the lot was less than half an acre, we didn't actually review it for the buildable lands inventory impact. We assumed it was completely redeveloping the property. That was less of an issue for housing because most of the time it was redeveloping the property. And because we weren't looking at small things like additions, that's something we need to look at further with employment permits. It's still not a huge amount of land, but we do want to look at that a little bit further, and we didn't have time to before this meeting. So, and I just covered a whole bunch of this. Buildable, same slide as we had last time for employment permits instead of for housing. Oh yeah, I just covered everything. Sorry guys, all on one slide. Yep, we didn't review those. Oh, just a reminder that if it was a change of use where it was going from retail to office or office to industrial, but there was no new building square footage added and there was no new parking area, no physical change, Then as far as the acres that were impacted from development, that would be 0 because it was just internal. Just a reminder about if the development site is split plan designation or split by more than one buildable lands inventory category. So it's part vacant and part partially vacant, or it's part commercial and part industrial. We tried to allocate how much land was being developed according to those splits to the best degree that we could. So I think that's the main things on there that we didn't talk about last time, and I will turn it over to Elena.
All right, so for employment permits, we have a couple of the charts tonight and then a couple of the charts related to efficiency measures that we're still working on. This chart might get slightly updated from this version. There's a couple of filters on it that I think exclude a few permits, but not very many. So we wanted to still include this tonight. So this is just the number of employment permits by subcategory. So those commercial, non-retail, commercial, retail, industrial, government, semi-public, ag-related. So also a reminder, there weren't any forecasts for employment permits. So a lot of the housing charts we have sort of the forecasts and the trend, but this is really just actuals and the number of permits for each of these categories. So the average so it doesn't include the partial year of 2012 and doesn't include the partial year of 2021, but the average, so between 2013 and 2020 was 124 employment permits per year. You can see that commercial non-retail has kind of consistently had the highest number of permits each year, and that there really haven't been any ag related permits in the past few years. And then in 2020, I just thought that was kind of interesting. There's sort of a larger number of both government and semi-public, and the industrial permits kind of looked like they bumped up a little bit. And then 2017 just went crazy. But really, you know, this is kind of going to help us more in the long term. I think we still need to kind of be collecting this data and just kind of monitoring the development as we continue monitoring.
Elena, do we know what happened in 2017? What happened in Eugene in 2017? That's like a significant.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really done a deep dive on like what permits or what, if there's like.
Yeah, like it was a boom of some sort, but then it tapered down. I'm just kind of curious. I think that it's interesting that 2020 is as normal as any other year. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was, you know, an increase. I just think that's kind of an interesting observation.
Especially with the commercial retail kind of didn't like super tank. It kind of, you know, 11, 17, kind of, you know, 13. So yeah.
And we are counting permits for, I guess I don't know enough about what is required for a permit, you know, but I'm wondering, during 2020, I think a lot of businesses made some changes and added, you know, spaces, and I'm not sure. I mean, I'm just kind of guessing. So I'm just wondering if that would require a permit.
It would require a permit, but if it was just an alteration of an inside space, then that does require a permit, but we're not counting that as in our monitoring numbers here. So we are counting additions. So if it was a commercial space that added an addition, we are counting that as a permit. So this is really new employment development and additions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else have questions or comments? Okay.
And then this chart is our large industrial sites. So in Envision Eugene, it was identified that there was a long-term need for a specific number of large industrial sites in specific size ranges. This was referred to as the large lot portfolio. And so as part of employment monitoring, we're monitoring whether any of these lots are being developed. So there's 26 lots. There are 15 outside the UGB and 11 within the UGB. And you can see them broken out by size. This on the second row that says 10 to 19 and 50 to 74 is this very, very, very large lot that is divided by sort of divided by a utility tax lot that has a stream running through it. So the decision was made to classify that sort of in both of those categories, even though it's technically the same tax lot. But as you can see, there hasn't been any development on any of those large lots during the monitoring period. That's about it.
Okay, I'm gonna move us along. So these are pretty similar to the buildable lands inventory impact set of charts we looked at last time for housing permits. So this first one is the annual average number of acres developed per year, excluding the annual average excludes data from partial years. So 2021 is not included. So just to think about that, it's the total number of acres developed per year on average, compared to the total numbers of acres that would need to be developed to meet the forecast on average over 20 years. So this average is for 8 years. This one is for 20 years. So what you're seeing is that the industrial plan designation had the most acres developed on average with employment permits, about 13.9. It also was forecasted to have the most. It's still much lower than the pace it would need to be at, but we'll talk more about that. Mostly, a big part of that is because the majority of the industrial land supply, or half of the industrial land supply, is actually in the UGB expansion area, out Clear Lake Road. And so that area is not served with utilities that would allow it to annex, which would then allow it to develop. And so it is not surprising that this is really low on average. But whenever that area is annexed or is served and then annexes, it's likely it could develop like all at once or more quickly. Then followed by commercial for the amount, which is pretty small. It's about 7 acres, again, below the forecasted pace that it would need on average annually. And I'm going to get into more detail about each of these plan designations. Government and education did not have a forecast for amount of acres to develop. The UGB analysis essentially assumed that public and semi-public uses, while there was a forecasted need for those uses, that there would be job growth related to those, but the development to accommodate those jobs would happen on existing land. And so we didn't identify a need for more land, but obviously that is happening. There is some development of that existing land happening. And then I'm just going to do the last thing here. I'll talk more about low, medium, and high density residential. There's a small amount of forecast to develop on those plan designations. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I think because of the scale of the chart, when we get to the actual report, I think we'll probably take the residential and the parks and open space plan designations off of this chart and just focus on the employment ones, because we'll cover those in the next charts.
Okay, Bill, you have a question? Go for it.
A question and a suggestion. Maybe the suggestion, just, this industrial forecast is going to skew the scale on the whole chart. So maybe you want to break that out or whatever. But also, are you able to, I'm just kind of thinking, okay, we just looked at residential and there was such a great preponderance of new dwelling units that were in a commercial designation. Is there a way or a need, I guess I'll just put it this way as a question, is there a need to kind of account for that as sort of, hey, part of the reason why we're not hitting this forecasted average of development of commercial lands is we are kind of developing some of it, but not for employment purposes. It's going into residential use or something like that. And I'm not trying to make
my next
policy
slide,
inferences.
Phil.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Okay.
No, that's a great observation. That's exactly what we need to try to pull those things together. It's not as much as I had thought, but it's still noticeable. Yeah, so I definitely want to talk about that. Is that okay if I go to the next one? Okay, so this is total acres developed. So we saw 286 total acres developed with employment out of the 1457, which again is significantly, that's a significant amount of that is for industrial. Let's see, what we saw was, well, I have it right here. The most development was on committed land. Committed, as a reminder, is land that is in public ownership at the time of the buildable lands inventory. 98 acres on developed, 69 on vacant, and then industrial was 118. So by plan designation, the most developed acres with employment building permits was industrial, then commercial, then government and education. For the report, we'll omit protected land because I don't think it's helpful. And there, the more that we can take off the chart, the more we can focus folks and also deal with scale issues. Let's see, what do I want to say about this? Oh, so I touched on this a little bit, but when we were looking at the total acres developed from new housing permits, that was from net new housing permits. And so what that means is we counted the acres developed related to new housing developments that actually added housing. So if it was a duplex and it was replaced with a duplex, we did not count the acres that were developed from that because it didn't add new housing. And that's what for housing, again, that's that black and white thing with housing. We know how many units we need to add. And so that's what we're trying to capture is the net new units and the impact from those units. For the employment permits, we didn't filter out the permits based on whether or not they added net new building square footage, because there's so many types of kind of employment or public and semi-public uses that don't actually add building square footage. So for instance, the new softball field at U of O, or a new softball, any field that any school takes up buildable land and is committed to that use. Usually there's bleachers, usually there's some kind of structures, but they're not really habitable structures. Parking lots is another good example. So we did include all of that here. There's actually about 90 acres of buildable lands impact that were associated with 0 building square footage added, or less, where there was actually a demolition. So it was a negative, negative building square footage. So we looked back into those, and there were about, let's see, what was my number? There were about, I looked back at the largest ones, the ones that were developing the most acres, like one permit I think was for 10 acres, but it had 0 square footage. That was like a field complex thing, if I remember correctly. One of them that was really big, it was like 8 acres, but that was actually for lumber storage. And so they were grading and paving the site and doing a whole bunch of improvements, but there was no structure, but it was still employment operations for the industrial use. So of those 90 acres where they were a little bit suspect because they had 0 building square feet, looking into those, about 40 of them actually were legitimate employment uses that just didn't have building square feet. Some of them were also related to, they were a tax lot that was next to another tax lot. So they were part of a development site where the other tax lot was the one that actually had the building square footage allocated to it. And this tax lot was parking or open space or stormwater, or something else related to the development, but the building wasn't happening on that property. So I looked at all of the large impacts. Then all of the smaller ones we'll have to look at a little bit more closely, like we mentioned earlier, those ones that were lots that were less than half an acre, where we didn't actually look at the BLI impact and we just assumed that the whole lot was redeveloping. We can either take those out because we didn't review them, or we can look at them a little bit further. And I think we're going to try to look at them a little bit further, and then we'll let you guys know what the results of that are. So there's a question.
Sorry, I see Kevin, I see your hand up. I was having a technical difficulty. Go ahead.
So is it correct to think that the land area that's represented by the adopted forecast is actually available capacity?
It is vacant available capacity, partially vacant. So when we have a large partially vacant lot, it's the portion that, or the amount of the lot that doesn't have development on it. And it is however much redevelopment we assumed put into acres, although redevelopment is not mapped in where it's going to happen. So those are the 3 things.
So if you look at the actual, oh, wait a minute, this graph doesn't have, yeah, it has actual. If you look at the actual versus the forecast, that addresses Phil's question, and I think Tiffany had a question about sort of supply and capacity. And did, for instance, Phil was asking, did the high density residential on commercial land supplant or push out or make harder job related development? And I think these graphs would tell me that, well, probably not, because there's huge supply of land there that was because of the forecast, or is evidenced from the forecast, compared to what actually happened. So it's not as if there was a zero-sum game there where one use was pushing another out. Is that fair to say, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we haven't done, which kind of occurred to me while we were writing up the notes for these, is that we've been kind of looking at the BLI impacts in silos. So if we look at, I'm just going to skip to this one really quick just for illustrative purposes. This is how many acres we assumed, almost 1,200 acres in industrial that there was capacity on for employment. If we were assuming housing was going to happen on industrial, we would have a similar chart that we looked at last time. How many acres are we assuming housing would happen on in industrial? And we don't have a chart that puts those two things together that says, this is the total acres of industrial that has capacity for new development in general on it. And this is how much in total has been developed. And it seems like that might be helpful. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're saying, but it feels like we don't exactly have those dots together yet. Yeah, okay. So it sounds like that would be helpful. I was kind of thinking of just a table because I don't think we can make any more charts at this point. But you know, that, I mean, we at least we certainly have the data where we can pull everything together. And I think that would make a lot of sense, and it might help illuminate what you were just talking about. Okay, how about I skip to this chart? So this is just a more fine-grained look. So where the last one we have, well, we had low density, medium, and high density residential grouped into one grouping, and then commercial, industrial, these plan designations, and then the BLI categories here. This actually takes each plan designation. So right now we're looking at industrial, and then looks at each BLI land type and indicates how much. So this is, you know, almost 1,200 acres we forecasted capacity on in total. And most of that, about 1,000 of it, is vacant land for industrial. And then we did assume some redevelopment would happen. We didn't have a forecast for any industrial committed land that would go to employment, but a little bit of that has happened. So that's how you read these. One note I want to say about the industrial forecast amount that's a little bit different than the other plan designations is that, let's see if I go back to this guide that Elena was talking about. So when we did the UGB analysis, we determined that we needed 13 sites that were in this site class range. We needed 5 + 2. We needed 7 sites that were in this size, you know, so that tells you how many sites we needed. And so when we came up with the forecast, we used the midpoint, the average size within the site class range. So we said we needed, on average, we would need, you know, 15-acre, we would need 13 15-acre sites. That's how we came up with the forecast. And so the result was we needed 495 acres in these lot size classifications that were outside the UGB. But when we actually ended up expanding the UGB, some of those sites were 10 acres and some of those sites were 18 acres. Some of those sites were 19 acres that fell into those site classes. And so while the forecast is based on that average, the actual supply is a little bit different than what is shown here, because that's how the math was done for the UGB analysis. Super wonky. I didn't feel like it was necessary to change it because when you go through the UGB analysis, it's all about needing 818 large lot site acres of large lots and blah, 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 blah. And then it says what our expansion ended up being because we were expanding for real lots. So I didn't change this, but that is something that maybe is confusing. I wasn't sure which way would be more confusing. Having this amount be more than what is stated in the UGB analysis, but is actually what we expanded for. So the only other thing I'll just add really quick before we get to the question is that, again, just as a reminder, about half of this forecasted land supply is in the UGB expansion area, which isn't even annexed. So that's part of the reason it hasn't developed that much. And the largest developments in industrial were actually two developments, the Veterans Clinic and the Yogi Tea manufacturing facility. Those were each developed 8 acres. So 16 acres total. And then after that, it was some lumber, like I mentioned earlier, a pretty big mail distribution facility, warehousing, and some shell buildings. Those were the biggest acres developers in industrial.
Okay, Phil, you got a question, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'm just being thrown by the header here where it says new employment buildings and additions. You're not counting buildings, right? You're not counting building square footage. You're counting just land, right?
Right. This is kind of the permit type, I guess.
Because you were just saying about how at least a certain number of these permits, you know, especially in industrial,
Yeah.
might be a lot of yard uses, very little square footage. There's an existing building and they expand the yard and they have a whole bunch more going on. So is it sort of a little deceiving to even put the word buildings in here? Because that's not what you're tracking, right?
I mean, it's part of what we're tracking. I mean, a lot of the development is as a result of building additions or new buildings and the parking areas associated with them. But you're right, that is, it just felt weird to say that this is acres developed from new employment because so we could just say new employment development instead of saying buildings and additions. Maybe that would be cleaner.
Or unless you really were to also somehow track whether on this or another slide, you know, what the square footage of those permits represents in building square footage, not just in acreage, right? But I get what you're doing. So it makes sense to me. Yeah.
No, but I mean, we can definitely do that. Development maybe. And this has evolved a little bit. I don't think that we realized how much employment development was happening that didn't involve new building square footage. Okay. I'm gonna go to commercial next. So range of uses here, we have 59 acres that were developed. I think the biggest one was a car dealership that developed over 6 acres. And then we had just a wide range: grocery store, hotel, convenience stores, storage facilities. Most of the development, 90% happened, I think it was 42 acres happened on developed land, whereas only 4%, which was the most, that was the forecasted amount was mostly for vacant land, which is the case for, I think, all of our plan designations. And then we really didn't see very much employment development on that. However, as Phil, you brought up earlier, there were about 16 acres of vacant commercial land supply that was developed with apartments during the monitoring period. And we had originally forecasted no housing happening on vacant commercial land. And that was mostly from 2 projects, but. And then our scale drops down a little bit. So now we're looking at, less than 60 acres developed here for government and education plan designations. And then, a little bit over 12 on parks and open space plan designations. Again, neither of these had an adopted forecast. So that's why there's no clear bar showing. Let's see. The majority on the government and education, the majority, the 57 acres, was schools developing, adding facilities, redeveloping. U of O is also mostly government and education plan designation. So that's where most of their development is happening or is showing up. And then parks and recreation facilities. And then actually that was pretty much the same except for U of O with the parks and open space designation. Those were also mostly schools redeveloping and parks and recreation. And in both of these, the development was happening on committed land, which makes sense because those would have been to be committed. You are, the land is publicly owned at the time the buildable lands inventory was run. So it makes sense that those kinds of facilities are happening on committed land almost entirely. And then a very small amount of employment development. I'm going to have to try to keep saying that. Employment and development was forecast to actually happen on residential plan designations. So those are for things like neighborhood commercial, like maybe a small office or a neighborhood cafe or a neighborhood corner store, those kinds of things. We did forecast that those would happen. We saw about 40 acres total that happened between low, medium, and high density residential plan designations. We forecasted about 53 acres. But in looking at that further, what we realized was happening is that there was about 8 acres that were mistakenly ending up being categorized as an employment building permit because the use is utilities and communications, but they were actually private street development for subdivisions. And so we need to actually revise our reporting system so that those uses get moved over into the impacts from residential development. Luckily, it wasn't very much, and we specifically gave those types of permits their own use because it was kind of a tricky one. But unfortunately, they ended up in the wrong bin anyway.
Heather, I just wanted to flag on the last couple slides. We didn't update, it says housing permits, but they're employment permits.
Oh, on the top
Up
left.
here. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
We're still in employment building permit land.
Yeah, we lost our presentation yesterday afternoon. So so I apologize. You're seeing that I didn't have time to go back through and really make sure that some of those things weren't cleaned up. So I apologize. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the majority of the acres that were developed are happening on committed land. So I looked back into that, and there's 4 projects that together developed over 21 residential acres with employment permits. And those were actually for schools again, and also for the new kids sports facility on Willamette. And so those are all properties that were publicly owned at the time the BLI was run. So that's why they're coming up on committed land.
Okay, I have Sue with a question or comment. Sue, please go ahead.
So on the last slide, when I was looking at this material this afternoon before our meeting, it may just be my ignorance, but where there's no projection, and so the bar fills all the way up and you can't really tell I think it's a little bit confusing there. I'm not sure that if somebody looking at the report would be able to quickly understand that there's no projection, that's why it looks the way it does. So I'm not saying you should do anything any differently than you've already done, But I think it is an area where there will be questions. I looked at it and thought, what the heck does this mean? Does this mean that it reached its goal or not? And of course, it didn't, because there wasn't a projection. But I think it's a little bit of a concern.
Yep, and so we did put that in the report. So all of these charts have some context around them because we're not able to, well, we probably are able to, but at this point we haven't been able to really make these charts totally dynamic to respond to all the situations. And frankly, I hadn't really thought about it. There's no forecast at all. Like there was no forecast at all. And so we did put that in the text of the report that that these plan designations, the reason they look that way is because there's no forecast. But yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
I don't have any other comments or questions, suggestions.
Okay, I'm going to jump to our calendar if that works for folks.
Okay.
So we just have, and I know it's important to talk about employment efficiency measures. And yet, I am really sensitive to that we've been meeting every 2 weeks. We really ideally wouldn't meet more than once a month. And so what I would like to propose is that the last charts that we need to get to you right now are, that you haven't looked at before, are the employment efficiency measure charts. And what those are the number of acres that are developed with building permits related to efficiency measures. Employment building permits that got an efficiency measure. So what I would like to propose is that we cancel the 4th and we send a write-up to you next week that has more information than the PDFs that we've been sending you, which are just the charts, but that actually is a write-up more in tune to what we have been giving you here. That will give you guys time to digest it. Because the building permit data still continues to take longer than we thought to make, you're already hearing that some of the errors that we've found that we need to reallocate things. I would rather not promise that we're going to get the report to you on the 4th and instead send out, this mini information summary about the efficiency measures. And then on the 18th, if there's questions or comments, you'll have that information well in advance. You'll actually have the write-up, so we won't really need to present on it unless there's any additional information that we need to bring to you. And then the majority of the 18th, 2nd, and 16th at least could be on the report. That will also give us some time. What I'm hoping, I've been kind of going back and forth about we're either going to give you the report on the day of the meeting and just walk through it with you, or we're going to have enough time to get it to you well in advance of the meeting so that you have some time to even look at it. And that keeps getting adjusted according to our schedule and how long the building permit data is taking. And so what I'm hoping is that by skipping the 4th, we will actually be able to get you the report before the 18th instead of dropping it in front of you guys on the 18th and walking through it. I would like the 18th to be a meeting where we can actually talk about the report. And this will also give us some time to think about what is the best way to go through a 100-page plus document that is just chock full of data. Because I haven't really done that before for something like this. So anyway, that's what I would like to propose. I'd love to get your feedback and see if people are comfortable with that approach, or if you have concerns or other suggestions.
Yeah, any comments, any concerns about this schedule, guys? I will just mention, and I know Kevin already is aware, and I let Elena and Heather know, I can't be up here and chair on the 18th, but I can call in. So if Kevin can, kind of man the queue and whatnot, I believe I would be able to participate. So I should be able to do that. Sue, go ahead.
I just want to say I support your summary of this, Heather, and think that whatever you think is best in the circumstances. I mean, it's a lot of material. You're presenting it in ways that are digestible almost. There's so much work that goes behind this before we see it. And so whatever you think is best makes sense to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's my vote. So if anyone else has any, I've got a thumb from Mark, I think. Phil, Kevin, we got lots of thumbs up. So I think we're good with this.
Thank you.
So
Thank you,
looks
everyone.
like a good plan.
Yeah, we really appreciate your patience. Yeah, we just really want to get you the report. It needs to be in front of you. So we're looking forward to that.
Right. Was there, I gotta pull the agenda back up. I didn't know if there was any other. That was it. So any other last updates or anything else, Heather, that you guys have, or are we gonna get 8 minutes back of our evening?
I don't have anything. I might just see if any other ETAC members have anything they want to share.
Y'all are doing a great job. I appreciate it.
Wonderful, you guys. Okay. Well, with that, speak now or forever hold your peace, as we will be reconvening November 18th. So we'll look forward to the report and keep us updated. If there's a change in the schedule or anything, just let us know. Okay, I'm gonna gavel out. So we'll see you all soon. So thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.